You're listening to Wondering Jews with Josh and Roy. I'm Roy.
And I'm Josh. This is the podcast where two youngish Jewish dads get baked and wonder what it means to be a Jew today. Today, on episode 81, we are still in Costa Rica, and Roy is now in his bed and is falling asleep.
Josh, there's a secondary component to those gummies from episode 80.
Yeah, what happened?
Well, they entered a different phase, a much more sort of physical phase, whereby my body feels radiant, but also very horizontal.
Well, you look horizontal. I wonder if people are making podcasts where people are just laying down in bed, like Pillow Talk, the podcast.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing right now, man.
We are innovators.
I'm pillow casting right now.
Well, today on episode 81, I was prepared for this. And as such, we are going to discuss our two favorite interviews of the last 80 episodes and then share them with all of you.
Yeah, this is a chance to pick back from the catalog of shows some of our favorite conversations with some of our favorite people that we've had on the show that folks may not have listened to or that maybe want to take another listen to because they're just great conversations. The first one on the list is Diane Goldstein.
Roy, I loved our conversation with Diane Goldstein. This is from episode 35, which was called Special Guest Diane Goldstein, Roy's Mango Kush. Do you remember the Mango Kush more or Diane more?
Oh, man, I remember Diane more, thankfully. I'm sure the Mango Kush was great, though. But no, Diane was, she's, at the time, she was chair of the Law Enforcement
Action Partnership.
Partnership, yeah, exactly. Which is a group that advocates for drug policy reform within the law enforcement community, which is a very challenging and important space to be doing advocacy work in.
Nice. And then after we play the interview with Diane, I think we're going to episode 75 or 72?
I think 73.
I was totally wrong, wasn't I?
You were in the ballpark. Yeah, episode 73.
Episode 73, Am Yisrael High on Tropicana Cherry. And this was our conversation with Eddy Portnoy, the curator of the Am Yisrael High, the Story of Jews and Cannabis exhibit at YIVO.
Yeah, this is super duper cool. I mean, I'll have Eddy come hang out on the bathroom floor with me anytime. He was a lot of fun to talk to, super knowledgeable. Had an interesting perspective on the whole conversation as a curator, and also a participant of the community.
Yeah.
So yeah, just a really cool conversation. I would love for folks to take a listen to.
Let's start things off from episode 35, our conversation with Diane Goldstein.
For this episode, we are very excited to welcome a special guest to wander along with us, the one and only, the inimitable Diane Goldstein, not only a friend, but also chair of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, and somebody who has been around drug policy since the very beginning of this work, and I'm really excited to wander with you. Diane, welcome to the show.
Such a pleasure to be on there, but I've only been doing this for 10 years. So drug policy reform goes back for much longer than that. So I stand on the shoulders of people who very clearly had this vision of a better world.
Well, that is what makes you a mensch, among other many good things, is recognizing the shoulders that you're standing on. It's frankly not something we hear a lot in the movement right now or in the industry, acknowledgement of the work that came before.
That's the marijuana exceptionalism issue that I think all of us are kind of dealing with. And the industry has become the industry and it's moved away from advocacy. And then the advocates in some aspects don't recognize that their work in marijuana doesn't go far enough. And literally they're kicking people to the curb. trying to differentiate between, hey, cannabis is, this life-affirming saving drug for me, but those people who use heroin and meth, you guys need to go after them, without recognizing that it's the same issue. And yes, we're not going to have heroin stores on the corner like maybe we do cannabis dispensaries, but we should be putting the same models of ending prohibition and stopping the harms of criminalization. Until we do that, we're not going to make this world a better place. Marijuana legalization gets us there incrementally, but it's time to blow up the entire drug war.
Amen. I couldn't agree more. And you're right. Incrementalism is sort of a dirty word in advocacy, because there are people who just, they don't want to do it incrementally, because they don't understand that you can only move large swaths of the population an increment at a time. But at the same time, it's not sufficient to say, okay, well, we got weed legalized, so everybody else can fend for themselves.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I just wrote an article that was published this week, and it took me a long time to write, because we are in the midst of very transformative time for policing that I think is really, really important. My organization in particular doesn't just want to reform police. We literally want to transform it from its basic core. And from a law enforcement perspective, we've been talking about divestment in many ways through the issue of it's time to defund the drug war. And I think it's really important that defunding the drug war as a start is a great incremental step that allows us to fund these really important models that all of us believe are going to work. And you just have to look at Eugene, Oregon and Cahoots. That's probably one of the longest standing non-law enforcement first responder program that is literally saving lives. But people don't have the fiscal resources to scale up and fund those types of programs. If we simply stopped criminalizing drug use, drug possession, using law enforcement resources to criminalize people who use drugs, we could take that money and invest it in our communities and would do more for public safety and community health than we have in the last 40 years.
So the Cahoots model, for people who are not familiar with it, in 2 sentences, can you describe what it is and why it's so successful?
Sure. So the Cahoots model is a non-law enforcement first responder that is triaged in the same 911 system, but calls are vetted. And if it's someone who is suffering from a mental health issue, then the call is diverted from the cops over to a paramedic. I think it's like a social worker, mental health professional, and they respond in their own van. And I think I can't remember which year it was. One of the stats I saw recently is there was like 24,000 calls, roughly maybe more, that have been handled by Cahoots. And like less than 1% actually needed a law enforcement response to back them up. And nobody has been killed in that time. It saved Eugene Police Department and the city of Eugene thousands and thousands of law enforcement resources in dollars. And it's very effective and it's working. And literally, if we could just scale up Cahoots in every county, in every city, it would help reduce the harms of the law enforcement system and over policing people. Law enforcement, we've admitted it for a long time. We don't know how to handle a lot of these calls. We don't have the resources. And, it's really unfortunate if you think back on kind of what brought us here is the tough on crime, fiscal conservative who, rather than investing in front-end resources in communities, took money away and invested it in law enforcement. And the only tools we have right now is criminalization, and we shouldn't. And because of bad policy making, it's continued to put law enforcement into situations that they don't have the tools to deal with in an appropriate fashion, and people get hurt.
Right. And it exacerbates the whole police community relations crisis.
Absolutely. And it endangers everyone. It endangers the community primarily, but it also endangers law enforcement. So as we move towards the complete transformation of policing, we have to do the hard work, and it's going to take activists and the movement working in some fashions with law enforcement. And, I think we're finally at the point that we're recognizing, not that protests have died off. I'm very happy that protests continue and that people are working in many different aspects to draw attention to the need for change. But I also think that now, since May, we're going into the election, is we have to start recognizing how are we going to effectively make changes. So in California, as an example, if there was ever a time for police reform, you would think it would have been this legislative session. Yet there were some significant bills that basically were killed because law enforcement opposed them. And I could say that about bills across the nation, not just California. And so, I think what we have to know is that everybody can come together. It's not going to be easy. It's going to require people listening to each other and people acknowledging the harms. Literally, law enforcement has got to acknowledge the harms of criminalization to Black Lives Matter and to other organizations. And once we do, I think that good policing can occur. And honestly, as I wrote this article, and one of the things that was just fascinating to me was public polling. Even in Black communities right now, people want law enforcement there. Us in the movement, sometimes that's jarring to think that people actually want policing, but we have to qualify it. We want good policing. I want the same level of policing that white suburban communities get across the nation. That's what we need. And so how do we get there? How do we accomplish that? And without calling people enemies or letting that political fray come in. And honestly, the law enforcement political rhetoric is stunning to me. I don't know, as someone who never engaged in that type of rhetoric, I don't understand how some of these union leaders live with themselves. I don't understand that they don't see the damage that they've done to the policing profession. And I don't understand how they are so intractable about their policy positions. And maybe it's fear. Maybe it's not wanting to be held to account for their behavior in the past. Maybe it's ignorance of not knowing, policing and its roots in the United States based in slave patrols. There's a lot of education and that needs to be done for law enforcement. And I think they would be much better off if they created partnerships with organizations that could come in and literally say, let me teach you the history. I think one of the most important things was when I got into the movement after my brother died from a drug overdose. And I started really doing research about the origins and the nature of the drug war. And as a police officer, to think that we're not teaching in our academies or in ongoing training that when you go back and you look at our drug laws and how they were fomented, marijuana was about the Mexicans during the Depression. The Harrison Tax Act was about heroin and the fear of the Chinese, and cocaine and the fear of Black people. It was baked in racism. And so law enforcement in many aspects doesn't understand that you can work and operate in a system that's systemically and institutionalized, baked in with racism without being a racist. And I think that for me was my epiphany, is I finally recognized, I've been called a racist. I'm Mexican and I was born in Mexico City. And I think it always used to strike me as an immigrant, and I'm not 100% Mexican, but culturally that's where I come from. I never understood that for so long until I got into the movement and really had to do some soul searching about who I was, privilege, understanding what institutionalized racism was, and then linked it to my experiences where I saw how we policed communities of color much different than we policed white suburban Redondo Beach. Because when I worked a multi-agency jurisdictional task force or a gang task force operating in that fashion, we'd go into the city of Los Angeles or into, other communities that were filled with immigrants or communities of color, and we police them completely different than we police white suburban Redondo Beach.
Right. Police always say, we don't make the laws, we just enforce them. But at the same time, every single person I ever debated on any legalization campaign I ever worked on was a sheriff or was a police chief. These individuals were adamantly in support of maintaining the laws that are there, and then from the other side of their mouth saying that they don't make the laws, they just enforce whatever people pass. It's dynamics like that are very challenging for engaging law enforcement, and I'm curious how you've been able to be successful in breaking past those conversations.
If you notice the big roll of my eyes back into the back of my head, I think for me, probably the significance of our organization is we bring to bear not just our personal experiences, but our professional experiences through this philosophy of harm reduction. How do we reduce the harms of policing in communities? And how do we reform the law? Law enforcement needs to be held to task to the cliche, or we don't make the law, we only enforce the law. Because that's absolute BS, because the criminal justice lobbying that occurs across the United States is worth, millions and millions and millions of dollars. And so the only way that we can effectively deal with it is by holding our politicians accountable and ensuring that they understand the proper role of policing. And so I always go back to education. I can't begin to tell you how many times I've sat in legislators' office across both parties. And the perspective is, when it comes to lobbying, you don't see the military being allowed to lobby in the United States. And the reason for it is because they're authorized to kill people. They are sanctioned to use state violence. They carry the guns. And it's the same thing for law enforcement. Because we are given this power to take someone's life, we should not have the ability to make laws. That's not our role. We were stuck in the executive branch for a particular reason. And you're right, in the sense of it's going to be really difficult to roll it back because of politics, Citizens United, politicians across both sides like to have that law enforcement endorsement. And so until we vote in legislators that understand this concept, that they shouldn't be taking money from the criminal justice lobby, it's not going to change. I think it's starting to change. People are actually starting to talk about it. So, for example, in California, the San Francisco DA took an oath that he's not going to take law enforcement money because potentially he has to investigate law enforcement. George Gascon, who's in what is now being called critically one of the most important DA races in the country, has said the same thing. They've also, with several other DAs in California, have started a separate district attorneys association. And so you see this progress that's incremental and it's coming. But we're going to have to defund the police unions. I'm much more about, defunding the police unions versus defunding law enforcement. Because until we get to a point where we have model scale programs and proper scaling up of community infrastructure that promotes health and safety as we, roll back law enforcement, there's still going to be a role for law enforcement.
So you do a lot of speaking, especially where there are political campaigns, where there are legalization campaigns or other drug war, prohibition, repeal efforts around the country. What are some of the races you're watching that are the most interesting, or where you've been able to help by bringing your perspective to the conversation?
LEAP as an organization is doing some pretty significant work across some of the cannabis marijuana legalization campaigns. And then critically, most important, we've endorsed the 2 psychedelic campaigns, both in Oregon and DC, but we're putting a lot of time and effort into Measure 110 in Oregon. We really believe that significantly Measure 110 is going to be one of the most important ballot initiatives. And if it gets passed in Oregon and it's successful, it could be a model for the decriminalization of all drugs in the United States. Not the decriminalization of drugs as we know it right now with criminal penalties, but actual true decriminalization like Portugal has implemented.
One of the things I found most interesting in the article's from Filter Mag, and it's called Our Movement is Strongest When We Aim High and Work in Current Reality. And you mentioned this is sort of how public perception about drugs was on the uptick before the drug war started, and how there needs to be a constant drip of information and you can't ever stop because it's so quickly things can revert and people change course.
Absolutely. And law enforcement has done an absolute spectacular job of political rhetoric and using the fear of crime, simply the perception of the fear of crime, as a driving force to undermine reform. And that's what I think we need to do on a regular basis to hold them accountable.
I understand certainly how your law enforcement background has shaped your work and your advocacy. I'm curious how your spiritual life has factored in, or how this drug war ending battle has shaped your spiritual life.
Yeah, years ago, I converted, and I converted before my brother died. My brother died in 2007. And I think for me, the spiritual journey in Judaism has really been much more grounded in the here and now. And I think what brought me to Judaism in the first place was the belief that there isn't a hell. I grew up Catholic. And it's funny because as I jokingly laughed, I grew up Catholic when Catholics were still using Latin in the masses. So when I did my conversion, it wasn't much different in many aspects from, the smoke being passed around and, the litany and the liturgy, other than the Jesus thing. Okay. That's a big deal, but
that's one.
But I think what for me that drew it in is I had my own personal Rabbi Kahane, who was actually one of our police chaplains. And we just had this extraordinary bond that was based on his view of service to others and his view of how police officers served their constituents and served their communities and what it meant. And so when I met my current husband, I was looking to find a religion to raise my son. I really felt it was important that there has to be something more than just mom says no, and this is the reason why. I ended up deciding after doing a lot of research, and I went to Rabbi Kahane, and he put me through a year program with him personally. What it taught me was kind of my obligation to others. It validated that real firm belief that you have an obligation to your community. You have an obligation to make this world better right now, not just for your immediate family, but for everybody. And that the obligation includes making reparations to people that you've hurt and damaged. And so when I look at my work in advocacy and I look at my work in changing drug policy and changing the criminal justice system, it's my form of a personal reparation to end a system that has harmed so many. And I think the beauty of Judaism, what a lot of people don't understand, is that you don't need a temple to go to be spiritual.
All you need is a podcast.
All you need is a podcast. But it's true. I don't need to belong to a temple to have my belief.
I've never felt less spiritual than when I'm inside a synagogue.
Yeah.
You know, it's not a spiritual experience for me. It's not a spiritual place for me. A spiritual place for me is in the ocean.
Yeah.
Diane, it's been great having you on the podcast, but before you go, we want to play a game with you. I know that you were in law enforcement in Redondo Beach for many years, and I also know you've been fighting the drug war for many years. And so Roy and I wanted to play a game with you called Drug Street Name or Redondo Beach Street Name.
Oh.
So the way this game is going to work, Diane, is I'm going to give you a name, and you have to tell me if it's a street name for an illegal substance or if it's a street in the city of Redondo Beach. Okay?
Absolutely.
The first one I have for you is Snow.
Drug name.
Correct.
Did you get a bonus point for saying what's the street name of?
Oh, that's a good idea. Okay, what's the drug?
Cocaine.
So that's 2 points there. I like this addition to the game, Roy. Okay.
Hey, I'm just here to advocate for Diane.
Okay. Elvira.
Street name, Redondo Beach.
Correct. South Elvira Avenue near Nob Hill Avenue and Highway 1.
Correct.
Okay, you're at 3 points.
Also, Elvira was a witch that I used to admire too, but right?
Well, I'm from Southern California, so I, as a preteen boy driving along Olympic Boulevard, I also admired her.
Exactly. Exactly.
Number 3, Red Rock.
Rock is a community that I live in right now in Las Vegas, but it is not a street name of Redondo Beach. It is a drug. Now, the issue is, I don't know if I know the drug it would be, so I would have to guess a derivative of methamphetamine, maybe?
You're correct. It was methadone was the correct answer. So I'm very impressed, I am.
Methadone or methamphetamine?
Oh, methadone.
Oh, that's interesting. So no, so I was wrong. I only get 1 point because I said methamphetamine.
I'll be honest with you, I don't know my drugs. So it's one of the small problems of the game.
Exactly.
Diane is so scrupulous, though, that she won't even take the extra point.
Spreckles.
Spreckles is a street name in Redondo Beach.
Right. Spreckles Lane, named after Klaus Spreckles, who was a sugar refiner.
That's right.
Back in the 1880s, yeah.
I
Okay.
didn't know that. There's a Spreckle school in San Diego. Now I imagine that he must have spreckled his name all over the damn place.
Exactly.
The next one, Addies.
There is not an Addies in Redondo Beach, and I'm guessing that's kids selling Adderall.
That's correct.
2 points.
I have 2 more questions. Blossom.
Blossom Lane is a street in Redondo Beach that ran north and south through North Redondo.
Yeah, near Artesia and Aviation Boulevard. Okay.
Amazing.
And then the final question, double points. Juanita.
Juanita's in the south end of town. It was the daughters of one of, oh, goodness gracious, Juanita Avenue. So we had all the streets in Redondo Beach, like the female streets were Gertrude, Juanita, et cetera, et cetera. So it was the daughter of some founder, some famous guy that helped, was a politician in Redondo.
I'm only going to give you 1 point, Diane, because according to addictioncenter.com, Juanita is also a street name for marijuana.
It's a trick question.
That's a total trick question.
It's a total trick question. What a punk Josh move. I knew it was coming, but I'm still
what? But I learned so now I'm going to Google both Red Rock and methadone because it's been a little bit since I've been in on the streets doing the drug issue. So what's my prize? What do I get?
Look at
Roy, what does she win?
Well, Diane, you win the right to name this episode.
Oh, goodness. I have no creativity. Do I have a day to think about it?
Sure. You got time.
Okay.
Got time.
Let me think about it.
this was a lot of fun. Thank you so much for being on. And while you're Google searching those designer drugs, I'll be Google searching Elvira.
Oh,
So I'll be right with you. What a trip down memory lane.
Oh my god. What a trip down memory lane. Holy balls.
How you feeling right now? Are you still blazed from your DC-10 gummies?
My DC-10 gummies. Yeah, man, those gummies were no joke, bro.
Okay, now that you're kind of like in a deeper level with them, how many did you really take?
Let's go with three.
Okay. And how long ago did you take them?
A few hours ago.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's good. I'm glad they're working.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I wasn't sure. That's why I took so many, just to make sure. I'm not good at dosing, is what I'm saying.
Maybe you would benefit from a more of a pharmaceutical interpretation, that you could get proper dosage.
Yeah, listen back to episode 80 for that reference, y'all.
Do you remember our conversation with Eddy Portnoy?
What? Why do you keep saying Edney?
What's his name?
Eddie.
I'm probably thinking of Tyus Edney, who UCLA basketball player.
That's ridiculous.
When you fly back from Costa Rica, are you flying through New York City to see the Am Yisrael High exhibit?
Oh, no, I am not. But if I were, I would definitely try and make that happen.
Me too, man. I wonder how it's going over there.
I hope it's getting some good visits. I hope people are checking it out. What is going on with the door slamming around here? Was that you slamming the door, Chloe? What? No. What's happening?
Well, even if there are ghosts in Roy's hotel room, there's still a great interview with Tyus Eddy Portnoy.
We do. We have a great interview with Tyus Eddy Portnoy.
Oh, man, that 1995 UCLA basketball team was so fun to watch. And you know what's fun to listen to? The interview right now with Eddy Portnoy. Today, we're joined by Dr. Eddy Portnoy. Eddy is the academic advisor for the Max Weinreich Center and the exhibition curator at YIVO, the Institute for Jewish Research. Eddy holds an MA in Yiddish Studies from Columbia and a PhD in Modern Jewish History from the Jewish Theological Seminary. And most recently, Eddy is a curator of a new exhibit called Am Yisrael High, the Story of Jews and Cannabis, which is on view now through December 2022 at YIVO, the Institute for Jewish Research in New York City. Eddy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
This is tremendously exciting. I am so excited to have you on the show, Eddy. Do we call you Eddy or Dr. Portnoy? Or
No, I'm not that kind of doctor.
Okay.
I can't prescribe. It's a PhD. I'm not like a real doctor.
You can only prescribe lore.
Yes, that's right. I like that very much. Thank you. I'm a prescriber of lore. That's very good.
You are a prescriber of lore.
I could put that on my card.
You can. See, look at this. We're adding value left and right over here already. We're a belated Chag Sameach, a belated Happy Passover to you and yours.
Right, a good Yontif to you guys.
Thank you very much. I think that a lot of people who are going to be listening to this may not be familiar with YIVO's work overall, and then would be very interested to hear about the kind of exhibit curation you do and then the exhibit that you're curating now. So I know Josh has some questions, but I would love to just spend like 1 minute on what is YIVO and why should people know and care?
Right. Well, thanks for the question, because that's kind of an important part of this. So YIVO is a historical research institute that is a partner institution of the Center for Jewish History in New York. To be honest, it's hard to describe YIVO in 1 minute. But YIVO was founded in Vilna, Poland in 1925, which is now Vilnius, Lithuania. It was created as a kind of, I would say, Library of Congress / Smithsonian Institute / University Department of Jewish Studies, in light of the fact that nothing like that existed at the time. And it was basically started by scholars who realized that no one was studying the culture of the Jews of Eastern Europe. No one was studying Ashkenazi Jewish culture. And if they didn't collect and study and analyze materials, the culture would just disappear. And so YIVO began collecting all kinds of materials. They sent out questionnaires to people, having people ask their grandparents, what stories did you tell in your lifetime? What jokes did you tell as a child? How did you play? What did you clean your house with? What were your superstitions? These questionnaires with lists of dozens and dozens of questions. And they also asked people to collect anything related to Eastern European Jewish life, from traditional amulets to things about clairvoyance and psychics to things about Yiddish theater, Yiddish literature. They asked writers to contribute their manuscript. So they, created this huge archive and library of materials that, as I said, started in Vilna. And, in 1940, it moved to New York. And there's this very long and complicated story about how things were hidden during World War II. And some of them eventually made their way to New York. And then they, after the war, they continued collecting. And the exhibit that I'm putting up now on Jews and Cannabis became part of that collecting mission. This actually started a few years ago. I happened to see Grav Lab's Menorah Bong online. And I thought to myself, that's amazing. And how can I get one? I thought to myself, well, YIVO has long had this mission to collect artifacts connected to Jewish material culture. And so I thought this is an object that should be in, a Jewish archive at the very least. And so I contacted Grav and I explained to them that I work at this historical research institute and that, I'm considering doing an exhibit on Jews and cannabis, and that I would like to put this object both in our archives and it would be in the exhibit if I actually end up doing it. And they responded very eagerly. They said, wow, that's a great idea. And they sent me one. And so once I had it in my office, I thought to myself, wow, this really might have legs. And so I began to do research, and I wound up digging up quite a lot about the relationship between Jews and cannabis.
Is this a lending library? Can I borrow that?
That would be interesting. Unfortunately, YIVO is not a lending library. All the materials in our collection you have to use on the premises.
You're going to have to find another way to celebrate your 8 hazy nights, Josh.
In doing this exhibition, can you tell us about the roots of cannabis and Judaism and what you discovered?
Sure. You have this item called Cannabis, which has never been officially translated as cannabis. And I think it's never been officially, and this is in the Bible. It's in the Talmud. It's in the Shulchan Aruch. It's in
the Song of Songs.
Yeah, it's a pretty wide array of Jewish texts. And for obvious reasons, I think it's never been officially translated as cannabis because no one wanted to do that.
Right.
Because people are aware of what cannabis is, that it's an intoxicant, and no one really wanted to loan it that attribution.
It was translated as calamus, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. In some places calamus, in some places it's fragrant cane or aromatic cane, things like that. Right. But what's also interesting is, a lot of rabbinic commentators try to figure out what all of the plants and herbs and spices that appear in these ancient Jewish texts are. And so you have, for instance, Rambam, Maimonides in the Mishnah Torah talks about Cannabosem, and he translates it as Indian hemp. And so Indian hemp is cannabis.
Right.
There's little question. It gets translated. Cannabis also gets translated into other languages as Indian hemp. And India obviously is well known as, a major resource for cannabis.
Right.
You wind up with it in Exodus. It's Cannabosem is an ingredient in the ketoret, which is the sort of mixture of herbs and spices that create the incense that's burned in the Mishkan, or in the tabernacle, as it's translated.
In the Holy of Holies.
Right. And so, and also you have Ramban, Nachmanides, who's a 12th century Spanish rabbi, who appears to claim that there's an element of the ketoret, this incense, that's called the maleh ashan, or the smoke raiser. And this is the element that makes the smoke rise up in kind of a pillar. And so Ramban appears to claim that the element that does that is cannabis, is cannabis. It appears in all kinds of places in traditional literature. It also appears as a textile. If it's actually preferred as a material to make Shabbos candle wicks with.
Have you ever experienced hemp wicks, for example? I mean, it's the same thing.
Right. Well, that's what it is. That's exactly what it is. It's very common in, in traditional literature. And it winds up, like the research that I did went from, looking into traditional literature. And I also found in rabbinic literature, there are a number of Moroccan rabbis who, in their responsa, reference hashish as, a commodity. There's a particular Moroccan rabbi, I think an 18th century rabbi, who, writes about how there's a particular merchant who received permission from the king to control the tobacco trade, which also included the hashish trade. This is just historical evidence. It's like an indication that Jews are involved with this, in particular in North Africa and the Middle East. When it comes to, Eastern Europe, hemp existed, but really only as a textile. It wasn't, really a smokable item.
Right.
Although if you speak to Yosef Leib Needleman, who wrote the book Cannabis Hasidus,
right,
he argues the original Hasidic Rebbes, it seems like they all smoked pipes. It's written that they frequently, had ecstatic experiences after smoking.
Tobacco's nice, but it's not ecstatic nice.
You're definitely not, yes, it doesn't throw you into ecstasy or, it's something even close.
Right. Or even just, one of the things that I've been trying to do with this podcast and in the work that I've done around cannabis and Jews preceding this podcast is remind people of the spiritual role and the spiritual application of cannabis. Because so much conversation, and rightfully so much of conversation, is focused on the medical uses of it, the decriminalization of it, the human rights around not having it criminalized, and the recreational use, which is a term I actually can't stand, but the legal regulated use of it. And I think the use that gets the least amount of attention is actually the spiritual use, and that's why I'm so excited for this work to get in front of a wider audience, for people to draw those connections.
Right. And in connection to that spiritual use, a few years ago, Israeli archaeologists found the ruins of a 3rd century BCE synagogue in Tel Arad, which is near the Dead Sea. And in it, they found altars that had residue of burned frankincense and cannabis. Mm-hmm. And they took it for chemical analysis and carbon dating. And they found that it, dated to the 3rd century BCE, and that it was, in fact, burned cannabis and frankincense. And so what this indicates is that incense, burning of incense, early on was an integral part to Judaism. And this is something that's been lost, over the millennia, that could probably be reintegrated into ritual for people that are interested in that kind of thing.
The Catholics kept it going.
Yeah, right. I mean, incense is prominent in many religions. And for whatever reason, over the years, Judaism lost it. Obviously, Judaism became a portable religion, and, Jews were constantly on the move or on the run.
On the run, right.
And, yeah. And, incense was one of those things that, it got left in the old house or whatever. They never made it into the modern era.
You don't think it was because they were sort of trying to distance themselves from the practices of other faiths, potentially like Catholic?
It could have been that. And it also could have been when ritual was concentrated in Jerusalem, incense remained part of that. And when Jerusalem was lost, that probably became part of the ritual that they stopped doing because it was no longer possible to do. Obviously, no one brings sacrifices to the temple anymore. These are the things that, once Jerusalem stopped being, the center, these are the things that tended to disappear.
It's hard enough to get kids to Hebrew school. Like, how am I going to get a goat to the shul?
If you serve them
Pop-Tarts.
Right. If you had them do some sort of tofu sacrifice.
Yes, that's very Portland.
As a kind of snack.
I know Josh's got a bunch of questions. I got a bunch of questions. So I'm curious, this exhibit that you're putting together that's going to be open soon, right? It opened on the 5th, a few days ago.
Right, May 5th.
Right. So one of the items in the exhibit draws a direct connection between you and this show. I'm curious what that item is for folks and how, sort of why you decided to include it in the exhibit.
There are a number of, religious related artifacts in the show. I mentioned the, Grav's menorah bong, and there, you produce Leor Cannabis Haggadah. Once I found out about that, that was a no-brainer to put in the show because that fits in perfectly with the thematic. Really wish that I could show sort of more of the interior of it. I'm really just showing the cover because I have limited space in the cases. It's really, really a wonderful Haggadah. It's original, it's thoughtful, it's thought-provoking, it's meaningful. I really loved it. And what was so, relevant to me was that years ago, and I want to say this is like 25 years ago, some friends of mine and I had a Seder where instead of the bitter herb, we decided to have the better herb. Mm-hmm. We obviously didn't have the Leor Cannabis Haggadah, but, we sort of winged it and, ad-libbed our way into, 4 bowls instead of 4 cups.
Now you do have the Haggadah and, there's always, B'Shana Haba'ah in the next year.
Right, exactly.
Opportunity. But part of what inspired me to put that Haggadah together and to do these cannabis Seder events in the past years was to continue to draw those lines between Jews and cannabis, particularly around the advocacy side. But also, I think it just makes for a better Seder. I mean, I think the Seder to me is, one, it's a celebration of freedom. And I can't think of anything that is a greater act of freedom than smoking cannabis. And 2, it is a relaxant, and you're supposed to be leaning to the left the whole time anyway.
Right.
And not being in a rush and being able to sort of get into the flow of things and be present in the moment. And that's, such a good reason for people to use cannabis. That's why musicians and artists certainly use it, is to be in the moment more.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's very true. Dare I say it's better than wine?
You dare. You're in a safe space, man.
Yeah, we agree with you.
4 bowls is a good goal.
4 bowls today can be brutal.
Yeah, it could be 4 puffs. It could be 4 anythings. It's really about just the mirroring of the ritual. And I do warn people in the Haggadah to, be cautious around what we call crossfading. If you're going to do wine and cannabis, just be mindful that they are 2 different agents that work very differently with your body and sometimes not in harmony.
That's true. I will say, just to point out something else that's in the exhibit, one of the things that I found was that in the Cairo Geniza, and are you familiar with the Cairo Geniza?
I am not.
No.
So a Geniza is a room in a synagogue that holds all the kind of torn sitters, torn prayer books. If a Torah gets torn, it's unusable. You're not allowed to throw these things away because they contain the name of God. You have to bury them in a ceremony. And so the Geniza is the room where you keep all this stuff until there's enough to bury. And you collect enough of it to bury, and then you bury it and empty out the Geniza. So in the Ben Ezra synagogue in Cairo, from the 9th century to the 19th century, there was a Geniza, and they never emptied it. And they just kept throwing stuff in over the century, like literally over a period of like 900 years, they just kept throwing stuff in. And it wasn't just prayer books and Torahs or, religious documents. They were throwing everything in, ranging from literature that people had written, business contracts, all kinds of letters and correspondence, notes, many, many different things. And they wound up with something like 400,000 different documents that was discovered in the late 19th century by scholars who were completely blown away by this because it was documentary evidence of the life of Middle Eastern Jewry from the 9th to the 19th century. Since then, it's been a major resource for scholars, working on all kinds of aspects of the lives of Jews of this period. As I said, there are about 400,000 documents. And there are, all kinds of great projects that are working on it. One of them is the Princeton Geniza project that's run by a friend of mine named Marina Rustow. It was suggested to me that I look in their database for fragments of this material that mention hashish. And I did, and a bunch of stuff came up. This does have to do with the wine hashish thing. I'm getting there.
We believe you.
So it wound up that there was a poem in the Geniza that's dated to about 1400. And it's written by this sort of popular bard named Nasir the Hebrew Literature. Like all of these documents, at least the ones I've seen, are written in Judeo-Arabic, which is Arabic written in Hebrew script. And this guy wrote a poem called Wine, My Religion. And he loves wine and doesn't like hashish. And it's sort of like a hashish wine battle poem. And he makes fun of people that eat hashish. Eating hashish was sort of the more common way to ingest it. And so, he says things like people who eat hashish, they slack off at work, their eyes are all red, and they eat everything in sight. And so what's amazing to me is this is like an early 15th century poem in Judeo-Arabic that references the munchies.
Oh, yeah.
I thought that was totally amazing. Like, it was, such an incredible moment to find that.
I've read blogs like that in the past year. We talked about it on one of our episodes, a post on one of the websites about this guy who's like, weed's fine, but, it's no alcohol, and it's, alcohol should be treated in a different category. And it's exactly what you're describing. It's just more contemporary and less probably poetic.
Right. And so, but what was so fascinating for me was that Jews have been involved with this, for so many centuries. This is clear evidence of it. And, so it was a great thing to be able to include in the exhibit.
That's wonderful.
So there are so many Jews connected to cannabis. I mean, and if you look at this recording right now, 100% of the people, of the Jews on this recording are involved in cannabis. How did you know where to draw the line and what to include and what not to include?
It's actually really difficult. And one of the difficulties really was there are really a lot of Jews involved with cannabis in so many different ways. There was no way to include everyone. It's just impossible. My space was limited. I tried to sort of hit the highlights. There are sections like science and medicine. Mm-hmm. There's legalization and counterculture section. The people in those things are like, obviously Raphael Mechoulam.
Of course.
He's a major figure. Lester Greenspoon. Carl Sagan gets mentioned. I wouldn't say he's necessarily a major figure, but he's such a well-known figure. To a certain degree, I'm not creating the exhibit for people who are experts on cannabis or Jews in cannabis. It's for people who may wander in and get to learn something about it.
Right.
So to learn that someone like Carl Sagan was a huge proponent of cannabis use will be surprising to people. That has a certain value that you don't get when you present something who's not as well known. People like Allen Ginsberg, Jack Hara, obviously, Bruce Margolin. There's like a whole slew of significant figures. And, like I said, I couldn't include everyone, but what can you do?
How did you approach, pop culture figures like Seth Rogen or Sarah Silverman, who are so public about their usage and support and also their Judaism?
I didn't include them. People generally already know about that. And since I'm an educator of sorts, I wanted to present people with personalities they're probably not going to know about or that they probably haven't heard about before. Seth Rogen's company, Houseplant, did send me an item for the cases. And so, he's in it in that respect.
In that way, yeah.
He is mentioned. I did try to contact Sarah Silverman, but got no response. I mean, these people were a pretty small institution and just seems unlikely that they'd be able to connect with us. I mean, I never actually spoke to or heard from Seth Rogen. I dealt with someone from the company. But it was still cool. It was great that they donated. And a bunch of other companies donated things. And what's great about the donations of these objects is that they're all part of YIVO's archives now. So there is now a cannabis archive at YIVO. Many archives work according to what's called a record group system, and things are archived according to RG, that's record group, and then a number. So 420 was already taken. So I'm hoping to get 4,200.
We'll take it.
Maybe the best I can do here.
Well, I have one last question for you. One of my favorite activities is going to cultural institutions stoned. I remember going to the Reagan Presidential Library baked, and it was a really powerful experience for me. I was wondering, as a professional, if you had any tips to be successful.
I would say that any kind of museum, particularly art museums, but any kind of, visual experience, where you can get baked and, just sort of take it in, it enhances the experience to, pretty significant degree. I would, people can do what they want. If you come out of the exhibit after having seen it baked, you might come out with a different perspective than having gone in completely sober. I wouldn't advise getting drunk and going to a museum. That seems like a really bad idea. But getting high, I think that museums should give out weed, frankly.
They should.
It enhances the experience.
Maybe, curating the strain based on the topic of the exhibit?
There are a fair number of Jewish strains, or Jewishly named strains, from Jack Hara to Dr. Lester Greenspoon, Kosher Kush, Hebrew National. The company Mazel Tov Farms has a pretty significant number of Jewishly named strains, as does Tikkun. So, maybe one of these companies wants to make a YIVO strain. That would be amazing.
Should sell at the gift shop.
It sells the gift shop. I had two last quick questions. One is, it seems to me from what I've observed over the last decade or so in this space, the response from the Orthodox community or the more Hasidic communities to cannabis and Judaism is not as, it's more mixed, maybe I should say. I don't want to say it's not as warm because there's diversity of opinion there. But that's what I've observed. And that's where some of the pushback has come from within the community around supporting legalization or supporting advocacy around cannabis. Do you feel like your exhibit might open some minds in that community?
It's hard to say. It might. It's interesting. The basic rabbinic ruling has been that cannabis is acceptable for medicinal purposes, but not for recreational purposes. That's been the standard trope. And, Orthodox Jews always tend to be, a little bit more circumspect, a little bit slower to adopt, whatever the popular practices are. However, there's lots of kosher CBD available. In fact, the Hasidic singer, Lipa Schmelzer, just put out a video that's sponsored by a company called koshercbd.com. The song he presents, like the theme of the song is how he can't really focus on the painting he's painting, but once he starts chewing this CBD gum, everything comes into focus. It's really kind of an interesting, view of, how the Hasidim, see this kind of thing and how they're dealing with it. I will also say that recently someone showed me a hechshered or a kosher chocolate bar that is being made in Massachusetts by Orthodox Jews. This is not CBD. This is a THC bar. It's slowly changing. I think that as it becomes, more and more accepted in the general culture, it'll become more and more accepted in, among Orthodox Jews.
May it be our people's new shmata business.
You know what? I think it already is.
I think it already is. Absolutely.
Yeah. No sweatshops, though.
That's right. No, we're talking about equitable and sustainable cannabis future.
Yes.
Any plans on taking this exhibit on the road? I mean, there's cities all over the country where I think this would be welcomed with open arms.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think other people feel the same way. We already had an inquiry from the Jewish Museum in Miami. We had an inquiry from the JCC in Seattle. So, we have to recreate it as a kind of traveling exhibit. It's certainly a possibility. I think it would be great anywhere. New York only legalized cannabis last year, and they haven't yet created a commercial framework for sale. So technically it's not really legal to sell, because I did want to have, YIVO branded edibles or something.
Come west.
It would be great to have it in a place where we could do something like that.
Well, we'll have to have you back on with updates on that, because I think it's a tremendous opportunity to engage the Jewish community on this subject in a really deep and meaningful way. And I really appreciate your work on this.
Thanks so much.
This has really been great. So just fly into New Jersey, pick up some herb, and then head over to the city. Am Yisrael High, the story of Jews and cannabis. It's on view now through December of 22. Eddy, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, guys.
Sei gesund und stark. May you be healthy and strong.
Well, Roy, what a trip down memory lane.
I feel like podcasting authorities should citation you for that kind of shit.
Well, I have good news for all of you at home, and that's that we'll be back our next episode 82, with an all-new Wandering Jews. So until next time, I'm Josh.
I am still in this physical plane, Roy.
Keep wondering.